Welcome to the London Free Press Podcast. I'm your host, Rachel Gilbert. Municipalities across Canada have been struggling to regulate short-term rentals like Airbnbs for years. And the latest debate is in the municipality of Bluewater, which is on the shore of Lake Huron and includes beach towns like Bayfield and St. Joseph. While local leaders try to regulate the rental properties, the investors say they're going to take a big hit along with the tourism sector. So today I'm talking with London Free Press reporter Brian Williams about the new regulations in Bluewater and what's been happening with similar regulations in other parts of Canada. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Hi, Rachel. I'm well. How are you?
Good. We're glad to have you on. I know this is your first podcast with us, so thank you for joining me. So let's just get right into the new bylaw in Bluewater. What is it? What are the changes that they're making regarding these short-term rentals?
Well, as far as the bylaw goes in Bluewater, they're trying to kind of get a hold of the number of short-term rentals that are going to be allowed to operate in the municipality. Short-term rentals, basically defined as any kind of like an Airbnb, anything that is out for rent that is under 30 days. Anything under 30 days is considered a short-term rental. So they're trying to put a cap and a limit on properties like that to kind of get housing back under control.
And why are they getting a lot of complaints about short-term rentals? Because these are beach towns where people are going to go and just rent a cottage for a week, right?
Well, I mean, it depends on who you talk to. I know that when I spoke to a counselor of Bayfield, for example, he did indicate that they were trying to keep some of the housing there available for residents, opposed to having the community as being kind of a hotel community, as he coined it, which is people coming in and out. They do want to have a local community and keep that going. So I know that there's places like community centers and places like that rely on volunteers. And if you have people coming and going, I mean, how do you staff those if you don't have residents in the community? So I know that was kind of one of the concerns that the politicians had.
Right. Were there any complaints from residents, people who do live there, about some of these short-term rentals, like noise or anything like that?
So I didn't speak to any residents directly, but when I was looking into the matter, one of the I guess he would have been the bylaw or the building bylaw enforcement officer, something to that effect. He had indicated that they did have complaints to bylaw enforcement officers regarding noise. I did hear through the grapevine of one report where they indicated that somebody came in and had a wedding at a relatively small lot where 200 300 people showed up. So obviously residents wouldn't be too keen on that.
Not thrilled. Yeah. There's a lot of municipalities across Canada who are starting to implement licensing for short-term rentals. I know that's one part of this bylaw, but another part of it is location limitations here, in specifically in Bluewater. What does that entail? Because that's kind of unique for this area, right?
Yeah. So the location limits that the bylaw is looking to institute would be regarding essentially the number of operating short-term rentals that you can have in the municipality. So the location limits, the first one that they're looking at is having a 15% cap of the number of short-term rentals that you can have on any given street. So just to give you an idea, like let's say there's 100 properties on a street, you could have a maximum of 15 short-term rentals on that street.
Okay.
Now, any houses that were rentals before, they were kind of given a bit of leeway, but I mean, as for going forward, it's the 15% of any number of rentals on any street. The second cap relates to property lines. So essentially, if you have a short-term rental and your neighbor's applying for a short-term rental, if your property lines are touching, you wouldn't be allowed to have a short-term rental. Like if you apply to the municipality, they're not going to grant you one because you have adjoining property. So that's basically the location limits, the cap on the number per street, and if you've got adjoining properties to a neighbor that also has a short-term rental.
Now, if somebody already has that, say they have two cottages that they rent out side by side, is that grandfathered into this?
It's my understanding that it is grandfathered in.
Okay.
From what I've read up on the legislation, it's my understanding that if you did have one and you can prove that it was a short-term rental beforehand, then it would still stand afterwards. But that was my understanding of the bylaw.
Now, in your story, you did talk to a realtor who has some rental properties himself, I think. And so the realtor and investors have concerns with This is going to hit them in the pocketbook, obviously, and maybe affect their resale. Is that right?
Yes, you could, because the licenses that you have to have in order to operate a short-term rental, they're not transferable to the next owner. So
Mm,
if I'm a short-term renter, or I guess an owner with a short-term rental,
mm-hmm.
if someone was going to buy it on the pretext of it being a short-term rental property, that's not the way the bylaw goes. I mean, they would have to essentially apply for a license, and it's not guaranteed that they're going to get one. Say, one of your neighbors has a short-term rental, or again, you've reached the cap on the street, as we just kind of mentioned with the location limit. So there's
Right.
not a guarantee that you're going to get it. So you couldn't necessarily sell it as an Airbnb.
Right. So you can't sell it to other investors essentially because it's not a guarantee. Yeah. Okay. So as of now, what do you need to do to operate a short-term rental in Blue Water? And when do these new rules come into place?
So basically, you have to apply to the municipality in order to get a license. It's a $750 annual fee that you'd be paying. For the entire municipality, the final phase of it was implemented it was August 15th
Okay.
of this past year. So if you didn't have one by then, you're playing under the new rules essentially. But if, let's say, you did have a short-term rental um, before those laws or bylaw was instituted, you had up until September 30th to prove that it was a short-term rental property, and in which case you would be grandfathered in. So
Okay.
that was kind of the last day as far as having a grandfathered in short-term rental.
Okay. There are some concerns that this is going to affect tourism as well. Some of the people that you talked to were concerned this is going to affect people being able to come and rent cottages, and then but on the other hand, the council said no, they took that into account. So how was that balance made?
So basically, it goes back to the grandfathering in of previous rental properties. So
Okay.
when I spoke to the counselor in Bayfield, for example, if you already had an existing, as I kind of mentioned, if you had an existing rental property where people were coming in and out, those weren't going to be affected. So it is possible that you might have 18% of rentals on the street because of that grandfathered in policy.
Mm,
So they are kind of taking that into account as for people coming in and out of the community. But again, the bylaw's in its infancy. So it's not really, it, we're not really certain how it is going to affect the tourism industry as of yet, because I mean
mm.
it is very, very.
Right. And would they be open to changing some things if they really felt that they needed to in years to come?
So it looks like that's going to be up for review in about a year from now. They'll take
Okay.
a look and see what's happened, and then they'll review it and do amendments from there. But that's still
Yeah.
a little ways. Yeah.
Let's talk about other areas. Grand Bend is one of the closest huge beach towns, to Blue Water, which again encompasses Bayfield and St. Joseph. Bayfield, a lot of people go to Bayfield to rent cottages, but Grand Bend's a party town, and people are certainly renting a lot more cottages there. What have they done about short-term rentals in Grand Bend? Do you know what their rules are, and have they had some of the same complaints?
So their rules are a little bit more lax. Like, for example, the cost of one in Blue Water is $750, where it's $500 in Lambton, which is where Grand Bend, the municipality, they fall under.
Right. Okay.
Um, so as far as limits and location limits, I haven't come across anything that states that X number of places can operate or can't operate. Um, I did see that they do have a cap on the number of people um, per Airbnb or per short-term rental, if you will. At, I believe
Okay.
it was 10, if I'm not mistaken. But again, there's limits for that too. It's 2 guests per bedroom, and with a maximum occupancy of 10 people. And then things go with parking. So if you have 4 guests, you got to have at least one parking spot for them too, right? So
Okay.
there's provisions for those kind of things also.
Now, municipalities across Canada have been starting to implement some of these regulations, in various forms. I would say over the last 5 years or so, because Airbnb is such a has it wasn't a thing maybe 10 years ago. There were short-term rentals, but it's become a lot more popular and a lot more popular for investors too, to make a business out of this. There is one new regulation in Lakeshore, down near Windsor, and they've outright banned completely any or short-term rentals. Can you speak
Yeah,
about that?
yeah. So I did read that also. A major concern from what I've read as far as that goes in that region is that the number has exploded. I don't know what the exact number was, but from what I read in an article, is that it tripled, or the number of them have tripled over time,
Mm.
and apparently as many as 150 families have been displaced. So the number of rentals have gone up so much that people don't actually have a place to stay there. I mean, I'm not sure if we're talking about year-round residents or if we're just talking about summer cottages, but it does take the number of permanent residents or seasonal residents completely out of the mix. So
Mhm.
I would imagine that that's probably one of their biggest concern is not having enough housing, or enough housing for people. Essentially, would be my guess.
Yeah, and that seems to be another concern in Vancouver, where they recently changed a lot of their regulations around short-term rentals. And one of their concerns was taking housing away from residents, and how the housing that was left was very expensive for anyone to move into and purchase.
Well, yeah, I mean, Vancouver's notoriously a very expensive place to live. What I know what you're talking about too. As far as I
Mhm.
know, that they're talking about as being a balancing act, right? When you talk about tourism and the number of short-term rentals that you can have.
Yeah.
I mean, it's pretty interesting to think that the tourism department's worried that if you take away the short-term rentals, you might not have enough tourists there to stay. I mean, I think that's very interesting and kind of speaks to the housing crisis.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Brian. We're definitely going to watch your stories on this because we know that you'll have more from Blue Water in the future for us. And we'll follow your stories and follow you at lfpress.com. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Rachel. Have a good one.